the Jesus Christ story is somewhat different in that he was not a sinner himself. He did not need to get redeemed. But nevertheless, that Christ figure becomes the example in some manner or form for all of us, right? And I think that it's just a universal desire for all of us to be special, to be chosen in some capacity.
These guys are borrowing from the Christian worldview, and you make an amazing point in this book, Hollywood Worldviews. You talk about the Christ mythology. Not saying that Christ is a myth, but expound upon that, the Christ mythology in the film. And you did use a great example. I think it might be the best one, was with Neo in the Matrix and Trinity in the Matrix and all these guys. I went, oh shoot! I saw this, but you expanded upon it so much more, and you gave it a name, the Christ mythology. Well, that was Neo. That was the Christ mythology.
Yeah. And, because I think that the Christ myth is really, in a way, it's a reflection of the hero's journey, which is a very universal journey. And Christ, as the creator, become flesh, it would make sense to me that he would embody the most universal journey that there is, which is the hero's journey, right? And so, it's not like the hero's journey existed before Jesus. It was embedded within creation itself, I would argue. In fact, that's what I do argue. But so in the same way that the Christ story is the individual who comes to understand their identity as being the chosen one in some manner or capacity, right? And that they bring redemption to their people who are in bondage in some way. And of course, that's a concept that applies throughout all of history, right? I think that's why it's one of the most powerful storylines. Now, of course, the Jesus Christ story is somewhat different in that he was not a sinner himself. He did not need to get redeemed. But nevertheless, that Christ figure becomes the example in some manner or form for all of us, right? And I think that it's just a universal desire for all of us to be special, to be chosen in some capacity, and that Christ figure becomes the emblem of freedom that we seek, and it embodies that. And so it doesn't surprise me that the godless will take that concept and employ it with their own purposes in mind. And the Matrix, even though it's a little bit old now, but there are plenty of movies that still continue to do the same thing. But what was so intriguing to me about Matrix was it unabashedly used Christ symbolism, and the storytellers even told us that. But it was subversive in that they were actually the storytellers, the Wachowski brothers, were actually Nietzschean. They admitted they were Nietzschean in their worldview, and they were simply using the Christ story as a means of self-salvation, that we can all save ourselves. We can all become like Neo, right? Yeah. So they were subverting the Christ story for their humanism. And that's a very common thing. So Christians are mistaken when here's the other side of the coin that I think modern day Christians, now they've become more educated on storytelling, but there's this sort of movement or whatever within that for Christians to find Christianity in everything, right? Or finding the Christ, like you find, Neo's like a Christ. Yeah, he's a Christ story. He's a Christ story. And you're like, well, wait a minute. That's not the Jesus Christ story. It's anti-Christ story, And so we have to be able to discern. Just because there are some good values in a movie, we should point those out. But that doesn't justify everything in the movie. It doesn't mean you should just embrace it all without really discerning, right? And I see a lot of Christians doing that now, where it's just sort of like, sort of like justifying watching bad stuff so that they can say, I can see the Christian imagery in here while there's pornography or something, that kind of a thing.
Yeah, and that's exactly right.
Again, it's not black and white though, because there's been a lot of debates and struggling over these, R-rated movies, and how much do you depict of sin,
Right, right.
and there's a lot to talk about. I don't think it's all just,
Yeah.
black and white issue. There's a lot of nuance for sure.